Thank you for joining us for another free ASTQB webinar on why we all need BA, business analyst training. Have you ever been caught in the agile wave and found out that your job now requires more business analysis skills? As our industry continues to push toward iterative life cycles, including agile, doing good business analysis is no longer just the responsibility of the business analyst. It's now everyone's responsibility to ensure we communicate effectively with the customer, understand what the customer needs, and translate that need into software that actually works. The BAs will still be the experts, of course, but we professional testers need to get on board and hone our skills. Today's webinar will talk about the important skills we need to develop and how to apply these skills to make sure the product we make is still the product that the user wants. Today's presenter is Judy McKay, who has enough certifications and acronyms after her name. I won't even try to go through them, but trust me, she's an expert. And she spent more than the past 20 years working in the high-tech industry with particular focus on software quality assurance and software testing. Judy has managed departments encompassing all aspects of the software lifecycle, including requirements design and analysis, software support, professional services, configuration management, technical publications, and software licensing. And her career spanned many different industries. She is coming to us from the future, if you will. She is calling in from New Zealand, so we were a couple minutes late starting the webinar today simply because we were trying to work through a few issues. So in fact, you're going to see her screen in a slightly different mode, but that's the way they do it in the future now. So, or will be effectively tomorrow. So I'm going to have Judy take it over now. She has a wonderful presentation. Please bear with the technical difficulties. She's effectively doing software testing from the future throughout the presentation. Judy?
Thanks, Dave. I'm not sure I'll be able to advance slides, but that'll make this so much more exciting. So what I want to talk about today is why we all need to have business analysis training. And you don't need that business analyst title to need the business analysis skills. And I just spent the last week doing an assessment of a project that's quite large, and they're trying it with no BAs at all. And as you can imagine, it is a mess. It is an absolute mess. And this is where often as testers, we have to come in and do the business analysis, because otherwise, how do we know what we ought to be testing? How do we know what it ought to do? So I think it's a good thing for all of us to think about and hone our BA skills, because like it or not, you're going to be in that role. Okay, now the exciting point. Let's see if I can advance a slide. Afraid to hit the enter key here. Okay, so why not just leave it to the business analysts? Well, you know, our industry is pushing more towards the iterative and the agile models. And as a result of that, the traditional BA that wrote the traditional large requirements document at the beginning of the project isn't there anymore. So ideally, we have a business analyst that's always associated with the project. But in a lot of cases, they've kind of been pushed out. And we have kind of the product owner, the subject matter expert, or the SME that's doing a fair amount of that work instead, and may or may not have any BA skills, of course. So I think it's very important that we all think about, we're all responsible now to communicate effectively, to understand the needs of the customer. And that, of course, is the hard part, right? Because the customer may not understand their needs. Be able to translate the needs into software that actually works, and then, of course, verify that the needs have been fulfilled. Keeping in mind, of course, that those needs may change over the scope of the project. So BAs are still going to be the experts, but they need our help as testers, because we need to flesh out those requirements. We need to understand those needs, because if we're doing the testing and if we're helping to organize user acceptance testing, UAT, we need to make sure that it's focused properly on what the software was supposed to do and what the software needs to do, which unfortunately, of course, may be different things. But as we move more into this iterative and agile models where we're more engaged earlier in the project, I think these skills become even more critical than they ever were. So we're going to talk about a few things today here, assuming my slides actually work. So first of all, what is business analysis? Because there's a lot of different definitions out there. So let's just settle on one. We're going to talk about enterprise analysis, what that entails, how you go about doing it, eliciting the requirements, which I think is probably the hardest task. And the problem with this being that a lot of people don't know what they need. They don't know what they want. They don't even maybe know the scope of the project. So they may know the part that they do, but they don't know how that affects other parts. So being good at eliciting the requirements is key to being a good BA. Analyzing those requirements, of course. And then, we build it, right? Get it all done, test it, validating the solution, making sure that what it does actually is what it needed to do. And we'll talk a little bit about tools and techniques and a little bit about the necessary skills. And I think you'll be happy to see that you probably already have most of those. It's just a matter of honing them and maybe thinking a little bit differently. So what is business analysis? Okay, here's our technical definition here. It's a set of tasks, knowledge, tools, and techniques required to identify business needs and determine solutions to business problems. Okay, you can see it's very, very well aligned with the way software is going these days. We want to focus on the problems. We want to focus on solving the problems. So no longer, well, theoretically, right, no longer do we have a bunch of engineers sitting in a room designing a system that they think is cool and then trying to find the business that wants it. Okay, the tendency now is more towards, let's talk to the business, let's see what they want, and let's see if we can develop a solution that's going to work for them. Now, solutions are not just software. And this is an important concept because we tend to think, of course, only in the software. So of course, we have software components and systems. Of course, we may be adding to existing software, adding new and cool stuff. But there's also an awful lot that can be gained by improving the business processes overall. They may be doing things inefficiently. I did a consulting thing recently, and they had a bunch of people that were doing stuff on spreadsheets because they didn't like the way the system worked, and they didn't like the format the reports were coming in. So they would double enter information. They would put it into the system, and they would put it into their spreadsheet so that they could get the reports they wanted, which is interesting. But I mean, how inefficient is that? Plus, duplicate data, all those kinds of issues. But when you're looking at what does the system need to do, you need to understand what the business is doing and why are they doing that? Because that's always the interesting question. So as testers, we're much better aligned with what the system should do and how to test it if we understand what the business processes are. And maybe some of those could be dramatically improved, save everybody a lot of time. And another solution often is changing the organization, changing responsibilities, changing who does what, making sure that you have, maybe it makes more sense to align some of these activities with other parts of the organization. Maybe there's interfacing systems that already do some of this stuff and we don't need to double create it. So there's a lot of things that we can do that are not just software solutions, but as testers, and especially if we're helping with UAT, we need to understand that these guys might be really going into a different way of doing their work. And, there's a lot of fear that goes along with that too. So very important for us to be, competent as full life cycle testers here. So some common pitfalls, because, nothing ever goes wrong in a project, right? Okay, how many of these sound familiar? Ambiguous requirements, when you look at it and you go, what? Unstable requirements, things that keep changing and changing and changing and changing. Now, okay, there is some amount where the requirements do indeed change. And there is some where you get into it and you think, we really need to modify that a bit. But when you see a real churning in the requirements, it's probably because maybe they talked to the wrong people to get them in the first place. And we've certainly seen this happen, right? One set has worked on the requirements, and if you're agile, right, they've worked on getting together the epics and the line items of the stories, and then those people left, and you've got a whole nother people in there, another set of people in there. So there's a lot of reasons for instability in requirements, but it's important to look at why. Unclear objectives, and this is a problem in a lot of projects where people are not driving towards a common objective. What are you trying to do? I'm working with some people that are replacing their ERP. Said, okay, well, what's the goal of this? Well, some people said, well, because it's new and it's got a better interface. And other people said, well, because it will completely allow us to do things that we cannot do right now. It's like, well, that's interesting. So you kind of don't have the same objectives. Maybe those aren't incompatible objectives, but it's interesting that we don't all share the same ones. Insufficient user involvement, I think, is a killer in a lot of projects where people are just not engaged. And as if anybody's worked on an agile project where your product owner doesn't show up or you can't find them, you understand how important this is. User groups that get overlooked. A lot of times, especially in a larger project, there's a lot of people that are interacting with it and that are going to be working with it. And if you don't talk to all those user groups, you can miss a whole set of things that people do. And this is one that I think as testers, we need to be really aware of, because sometimes you just get this as a little nuance when they say, well, oh, I don't do that. Somebody else does that. That's not my job. They go, oh, really? But we're not talking to anybody who has that job. So we need to broaden our scope here. Another pitfall, business processes are just misunderstood. People don't know how they work or why they work that way. And I've certainly had a few where it's been discounted, and they've said, well, we don't need to carry that forward. But you say, okay, well, then what are we going to do instead? This is a business requirement. We can't just say we're not going to do it. What are we going to do instead? So, making sure that we clearly understand the processes, particularly the weird ones, and understand why they're there. And then my favorite, contradictory or missing requirements. You get requirements that absolutely contradict each other because you've got two different groups and they want different things. Somebody's got to mediate. Somebody's got to figure out what the right solution is. And then, of course, missing requirements are the hard ones to find because they're not there. And this is where you really need to have a good understanding of who all should be contributing. So why do these problems happen? Well, time pressures. It's a big one. There's just not enough time to really think about it and really, understand who the users are, who needs to be involved, that kind of a thing. The tendency to rush to code. Wow, we'll do the requirements as we go. Okay, a bit of an agile-ish approach, but we don't want to just say, okay, we've got to just get code. We've got to write code. Well, what's the code doing? What's the point of the code? Because it's a lot harder for us to test it if we don't know why it was written. Cost cutting, and I put that in quotes because sometimes it's considered to be a cost cutting measure to not have a business analyst on the project. Every project I've been on, that has not been true. It's been a lot more expensive because we didn't have somebody in there that was really working on the understanding the user needs, getting the user involved, keeping the user involved, and being that kind of voice for the user. Even when there is a product owner, you still need that other kind of more technical view that's kind of got the overall view. BA value is not understood. It's like, well, what do they give me? I don't need requirements. I'm just, they don't really add any value. We'll just cut them out. Another reason these things happen, bad habits. Some companies get into bad habits. Honestly, they don't do projects well. They don't think about it. They just kind of blunder along. And it's a bad habit, especially if they've gotten away with it a couple times. We had somebody that came back recently from a project and said, they're actually a CMM level -5, pretty sure. Okay, bad habits, right? They're getting away with it because they've got good people. It's the old skills and heroics thing. But it gets you in the end. Eventually, you're going to get caught with that. And then insufficient maturity. Just, you're just starting out, or you think you can run it in a kind of a cowboy way without really putting the time and effort into understanding what you're trying to build and how you're trying to build it. Okay, now this slide's a complete mess here because it was going to be an action slide and it was going to be awesome. I just want to tell you that to start with. But we basically have the 5 steps here of the business analysis process. We have analysis, specification, development, testing, and deployment. And at each one of these, we have activities that need to happen. So if we look at the analysis, there's the defining the as is, which is what it is now, and the to be, which is what we want of the business processes, figuring out our business case, doing the feasibility study, getting the money is what that really means, and then preparing the ideas for the solution. At specification, this is when we're documenting the requirements into whatever form needs to be. Okay, this could be into epics and stories. This could be a monolithic requirements document. It's whatever makes sense. Validating that with the customers, and then of course making updates when the customers say that's not what I want. Development, so a BA business analysis tasks here, supporting development during implementation, clarifying any issues, answering questions, resolving any problems, and then validating the solution as it evolves. Now this is an important factor here because you don't want to get to the end and have somebody say, oh, that's not what we wanted. You want to be validating this as it grows. A good business analysis viewpoint here helps to make sure that it really is meeting the needs of the customer. Supporting creating tests, of course, and managing change. And that's a critically important one, because if nobody's managing change, you know, basically change manages us, right? You end up with changes that are out of control. They're changing your scope, you're changing your schedule, and impact is not really understood. So I think that managing change is critically important, particularly during the development process. And I've certainly found myself in that role as a test manager to say, you know, yeah, you're making these changes, and I understand why you're making these changes, but let's also understand the schedule impact and why we're doing this, and if we should be doing it now, or if we should be doing this in another release. So, you know, that managing change is really an important aspect. During testing, our business analysis viewpoint here, verifying the test results, resolving any conflicts. This is when the tester says, well, it doesn't do what it should, and the developer says, yes, it does. And it goes to the BA to say, okay, which is right? What should it do? Because I mean, so we're not trying to win over development mostly, but we do want to know what it should do. And if the requirements have had some maybe issues or vagueness in there, we need to understand that what we're testing is really what we wanted to have. Helping to prioritize defects. It's always been hard for me in testing to understand the true business impact of a defect, because you look at it and you go, you know, that doesn't seem too bad. There's a workaround. But if I don't understand what the business does, that might be something they do every single day, and it's going to drive them crazy. So getting that outside viewpoint. Now, again, in Agile, if you've got a product owner, they should be able to do a lot of this for you, but they may not have the breadth of knowledge that they need across the project, and they may not be able to bring the, you know, the decision, the mediation, shall we say, that's not a great word, but between development and testing, if they're really having a conflict, you know, to be able to step back and say, okay, well, this is really what we need. And that's where a BA is often better, because they're more skilled in that. That's one of the things that they do. Also during testing, helping prepare the UAT tests, and of course, supporting the UAT testers, because now ideally, these are the people that were used for the requirements in the first place, so they're not getting a surprise. If they're getting a surprise, that might be an issue. But also writing the tests in a format that they're going to understand, making sure it's not scary. And then in deployment, resolving any usage issues, because there often are, especially if you've changed business processes, there's confusion. Making sure that defects and change requests are prioritized, updating the business processes as needed, because, I thought we did it this way, but, you know, really would be better to do it this way. And very important, following that through, ensuring that the customer is satisfied with what they got. So the 5 steps there, and the parts of them, even though it's really an ugly slide now. It was really pretty, I gotta say. Yeah, just a little point here. Not sure if you can read this because it's a little bit fuzzy. In the first box here, we have how the customer explained it, and then how the project leader understood it, how the analyst designed it, how the programmer wrote it, and how the business consultant described it. I like that with the fluffy chair. Then we have the bottom row here, how the project was documented, none. What operations installed, which was just the rope. How the customer was billed was for the full roller coaster. How it was supported, yeah, not so much. And what the customer really needed was just a tire swing. And this is what so often happens, right? It goes through so many hands, you end up not really remembering what the customer really wanted and not delivering what the customer really wanted. So hopefully that business analysis viewpoint keeps that in mind always. You're always thinking about what the customer wants and giving them what they need. But in order to do that, we've got to find the stakeholders. Now, again, hopefully they're not hiding under our couch. They could be, but it can be amazingly difficult to identify the stakeholders, because especially in a big project, there could be a lot of people that use the system and use it intermittently. So somebody that checks, once a month I run this report, but finding all of those people and being able to round them up and understand their needs can be really difficult. So I think this is one of the key points of doing good business analysis. And obviously for us as testers, when we want to solicit information about how you use it, why you use it, what are you doing, we need to know who those people are. What do they really do? So it's a hunt. I got to tell you, it's a hunt. And the nice thing about stakeholders, or maybe not the nice thing, but as you talk to one, they'll say, oh, well, you ought to talk to these people too. So it tends to become a giant bunch of people, but better to have, I think, too many than to miss some critical ones, because it's hard to go back later because you completely missed a capability that the software should have had. Now, sorting out the needs versus the expectations. Okay, so different stakeholders have different needs and different expectations. But the killer here is that sometimes the needs don't match the expectations. Okay, so generally, when we're building a product, we're building it to fulfill needs. But if it doesn't meet their expectations, they're going to be very disappointed with it. Well, unless it's better. But it's a tough thing, right? You can say, well, this does everything you need it to do. And they say, yeah, but I thought it was also going to do this. So they're unsatisfied, even though they got exactly what they needed. So getting the needs and the expectations together is quite difficult, honestly, depending on who you're working with. But it's an important thing for customer satisfaction. Life is a lot easier if our customer is happy with what we give them. That's just true. So the more that we can give them something that matches their needs and they understand what the expectation should be, the happier they're going to be with it. Identifying the business processes. Now, this is, I think one of the important things is we got to figure out what are they doing now? And then we figure out what they want to be doing. Okay, so it's the as is and the to be. And you may hear those terms a lot, especially around business processes. If you're doing like ProMap to map business processes, there's a lot of tools out there that do that. But this is often done, right? We have the as is, and these are step-by-step kind of workflows of the business processes. And the to be is how it's going to work in the future. Now, obviously, these things are golden if you can have the to be solution there, because you've got basically your whole process map, right? It tells people how to use the new solution. And if you can compare the old to the new, it's really easy to make sure that nothing is dropped. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you have one or the other, or what you have for as is not really current. So as testers, it'd be golden if this was true, you know, if we had true as is and the true to be. But it's better than nothing, right? It lets us do some gap analysis. It lets us figure out, you know, where we are and where we're going to be. And also it gives us a clue of where we might hang up in UAT, because people are going to be confused by this. So good to know, good to learn to read process maps. They're, you know, very helpful. They're pretty straightforward, but it gives us a better feel of what the business really does. So understanding that the needs and the goals of the business. Business goals are the short-term and long-term objectives of the organization. Okay, what are they trying to accomplish, basically? Business needs are the problems or the opportunities that we're going to solve or meet, shall we say. So they're not really the same thing, right? So business needs are more of the short term. You've got problems right now, you've got opportunities we'd like to take advantage of, and we'd like to provide a solution that deals with those. But we want to do that within meeting the short and the long-term business goals. Okay, so satisfying the needs and not meeting the goals is not really productive in the long run. So, you know, if we're looking at a software project that's going to be around for a few years, we want to make sure we're really solving that overall problem. And obviously the trick here is to match the two together to make sure that what we're doing is really fulfilling their long-term needs and goals. So defining the solution scope. It's always really hard to narrow in the solution. So maybe we're not doing a major project. Maybe we're just making a cool little mobile app that's going to do something. Okay, what are we trying to do? Exactly what is this going to do? So we're not trying to boil the ocean here. We're not trying to solve world hunger. We're not trying to do anything huge. We just want our application to solve the problem it's meant to solve. But sometimes it's hard to stay limited. And the more you open up the discussion, especially if you allow a lot of changes, people tend to keep expanding. They tend to keep letting it get bigger and bigger and bigger. So defining that solution scope and actually fencing it in and making sure it doesn't leak out beyond that will help keep your project on schedule. It'll help us understand our basically the scope of effort that we have to put in, and it will make sure that we've got the right people available at the right time. As soon as our scope is not well defined, who knows how long it's going to take? Who knows what it's going to be? Now, maybe that's fine. Maybe you're working in a startup company, you're developing a new product, you're just going to kind of keep going until it gets developed. Cool. And I hope your venture capital money doesn't run out, because that would be sad. But a lot of people are dealing within fixed timelines and fixed budgets. So your scope has to fit within that. And it's important to keep that in mind, because it's easy to let scope creep. You just, people say, well, I just want this one more thing. This would make it so much better if I had just this one more thing. And, you don't want to be the person who goes, no, you can't have it. But realistically, you can't add a lot of favors in there. You'll blow the scope. So really important to understand what it is, get everybody to sign off and agree to it. That way, hopefully everybody's happy with what you do. Now, configuration management. So requirements in whatever form, and yeah, I don't care if you've got the tiniest story to the most monolithic document, they're going to change. Obviously, our goal here is to stay within our scope, communicate the changes, and make sure that they're documented so that we have versioning. We understand what we've got here. I've worked on projects where they've used Confluence for the requirements, which ends up being very easily changed. Now, you can turn on so that you're told anytime there's a change made. But if you're trying to test against those really, really volatile requirements, you find that your testing is invalidated every day when you log in and you look at your change list. So we want to make sure that changes don't just happen, that they're discussed, that it's the right thing to do, that everyone agrees that it's within scope and can be accommodated, and they're documented so that we know which version of requirement we're working to. Same thing's true with stories, right? Stories evolve, you add more stuff to them. But if you're adding more stuff to them at the same time that the tests are being written, you got to sync those two together. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a story that has more capability than is going to be tested, or perhaps is more than the customer even wanted. So we want to make sure we've got good change management in place. Good configuration management system helps us to avoid misunderstandings, and it helps us to avoid spending a lot of time testing stuff we didn't need to test. Now, again, this goes back to requirements, this goes back to business analysis, and if you haven't got a BA that's handling this, for your own sake, it's a good idea to put this in place. Otherwise, you're probably going to go nuts. Not that we're far from it in a lot of cases, but change management, ideally we have a request, then that request is analyzed, it's evaluated, it's planned for, then it gets implemented, and then it's the whole change experience there is reviewed and the change request is closed out. Now, all of this is done within the concept of understanding the budget, the schedule, and the full cost of the change. Okay, so remember, there's opportunity cost. If your developers are doing this thing, that means they can't do something else. So it's understanding that full cost, not just, it's only going to take 10 minutes, therefore 10 minutes isn't that expensive. Maintenance, documentation, all of those things that might be a factor in there. So change management, rather a good comprehensive process. The better it's managed, the easier life is for everybody on the project, really. Now, eliciting requirements. When we're trying to elicit requirements, pulling teeth, right, as sometimes we think. Well, first of all, we need to do this because we need to understand what they want. What are the desired functions? What are the characteristics? Do we have any limitations that we need to work within? And expectations. Remember that alignment of needs and expectations. This is where we want to talk to people, figure out what they really want. Establish the scope of the solution so we understand what we're doing. And then, of course, we can work to a budget and a schedule. Orient the requirements to the project vision. So what is the project trying to accomplish? And can we make sure that the requirements are actually going to do that? So sometimes there's a project vision that's made by, maybe somebody higher in the executive ranks of a company. And then you get the project team together and they're going, oh yeah, but it'd be great if it did this and this and this and this. Well, are you still in alignment with the project vision? Because you've probably got a product sponsor out there who's paying the money for it. You want to make sure that what you're going to deliver is actually what they think they're paying for. And then the hard part, excluding features that aren't wanted and aren't needed. And this can be tough because you end up saying, well, you don't really need that. People go, but I want it. Well, but you don't need it because you could do it this way. Oh, but that's harder. So this is where it's so important to understand that scope. This is why a lot of like vendors that come in to do a software implementation will say, okay, change request, right? They don't have to argue with you about it. It's like, okay, fine, pay for it. If you want it, pay for it. But if it's your own internal team, it's a lot harder because your developers are going to go, well, it's not that much harder for me to do that. And, this is how you kind of slowly scope creep on it. So it's somebody's got to kind of have the, kind of be the bad guy. And this is often where the business analyst comes in to say, okay, well, These are things that are not in the critical path. We'll put these to the side. We'll discuss them later when we get through all the other features. And, so good techniques for handling that, good techniques for dealing with people really can get through these issues that can be quite difficult if they're not handled well. And then the how of eliciting requirements. Well, questionnaires, it's when you send out questionnaires to people and hopefully they answer. Interviews, usually pretty effective because you're sitting down talking through them. Well, what do you do? How do you do it? Why do you do it? That kind of stuff. And brainstorming. Get folks in a room and say, okay, well, this is a problem. What do you think? How do you think we should solve this? Do you think this would work? Do you think this would work? Kind of getting them all just tossing out ideas. If you've got a group that works well together, that's a great way to get good, new, original ideas. But it does have to be moderated. It does have to be controlled so that you make sure that you don't go way off the rails. Well, somewhat off the rails is good, but it has to be within a certain period of time and all. And then reviewing documentation of existing systems, existing processes, and observing, because documentation tends to be out of date. So, well, I've done so many projects to say, well, there's no requirements. Okay, great. Are there requirements for how the system works now? Yeah, there are. They're really out of date though. Like, oh, well, thanks so much. That's like, 5-year, 10-year-old information about this. So reviewing the documents, but taking with a grain of sand, observing what people really do. But the problem with observing, of course, is you're going to miss things like the once a month, once a year kinds of transactions, because everybody forgets about those till they actually do them. Oh geez, sorry about that. Wild mouse. And then things we can't forget to do when we're eliciting requirements. What about, okay, so ISO 9126, we all remember. Functionality, of course, is the one that we usually go after. What about reliability? How reliable does this thing have to be? Is this critical software? Or is it something that if it dies, it doesn't matter? Is it a game app on your phone, or is it your financial system? Usability, how important is that going to be? And again, is it a game on your phone or your financial system? Honestly, if it's your financial system, you probably have to use it anyway. So even if it's a bit difficult, that's life. If it's a game on your phone, you're going to go, I don't like this one. I'm going to go get another one. So, understanding your market, understanding your users, what your usability requirements are. Efficiency, performance, how fast does this have to be? What if it's a memory hog? Is that going to be an issue? What kinds of things do I need to think about testing for this? Maintainability. How are we going to maintain this? How are we going to send updates? How frequently can we do updates? And portability. Is this thing going to run across a bunch of different phones, a bunch of different browsers? What's it going to work on? What's its environment? Now, as testers, we already know these are good things to ask in requirements review meetings. But if we put on our business analysis hat, we should be eliciting this stuff from the users or from the customer. What do you need it to do? How does it work? How important is this to the company? That's the kind of stuff we need to talk about. So again, it's not that far a stretch from what we do as testers to actually take it one step further, but we need to be involved in this so that we ask the right questions and we get this information, because we sure need to know it when we get into testing. Creating traceability. If you don't do that up front, you've already got a problem, because requirements come from some source. There is always some source of the requirements. Are there any requirements that relate to other requirements? Okay, now we need to know this, because if something changes, what's affected by it? And of course, as we said, right, requirements do change, workflows change. We say, well, you know what? We're actually not going to track inventory that way anymore. We're going to do it differently. It's like, oh no, how many requirements were related to inventory? So if you don't have traceability in there somehow, that's a big factor. And one of the things that I've found to be helpful, especially on projects that have been pretty volatile, agile projects that have been obviously not very agile, but where we had a product owner change. So you think, well, okay, so what did that previous product owner tell us? And now we've got a new one. Maybe we better go back and review all of these things that went through this particular person. Or maybe there was just one of the stakeholders in the team that changed. Now I've got to go back and see if what they said is still supported by the new stakeholder. So good idea to have that traceability. Who did you get this information from, or where did it come from? And then, of course, also tracking our updates and changes. This goes back to configuration management. How do we communicate the changes to stakeholders? Because if something changes, and we're bad about this within the development team, development changes it, the tester knows about it, go, okay, yeah, that's good. Did we ever tell the stakeholders? By the way, we're actually going to do this differently now. So having a plan in place of how to actually tell the stakeholders is really helpful. And how are we going to tie the two together, our change management with our traceability? When we make a change, are we sure that we actually reflect that through the traceability? So important to build this up front. Now, obviously, if we've got our requirements, again, in whatever form they're in, they could be stories, it could be a giant document. If we've got good traceability to where those requirements came from, pretty easy for us to trace our tests back to those requirements. And maybe our tests are acceptance criteria, maybe they are test conditions, maybe they're fully documented test cases, whatever. We still need to tie that back, because if something changes, we need to know what's affected. Then we get on to establishing the baseline. Now, the whole point of the baseline is to say, okay, we all agree, this is what we're going to do. Okay, and if anything beyond that is probably going to be a change request, which means we need to evaluate schedule and budget as a result of that. Now, that is very, very, very unagile, honestly. But again, agile projects are mostly working within schedule and budget constraints. And you've got the concept of your stories. You kind of have a concept of what it's going to be. So your baseline is still basically the same. There's just maybe a little more wiggle room in an agile project. But the whole idea of the baseline is to say, okay, we agree that this is our starting point. We agree here. And if we're going to make changes from this, we need to evaluate those changes through our change management system. So getting that baseline in place, it's kind of it's often a contractual thing, but it also lets everybody start from the same point, start from the same point of understanding. And that's really what we need. So rules for good requirements. Okay, these should be pretty obvious, right? Unambiguous, my personal favorite, because vague requirements drive me crazy. And of course, when they're ambiguous, the developer may take it one way, the tester takes it another way, and you could argue very well for either path. So you better hope that whoever wrote that requirement can clear it up for you later. They need to be precise. Okay, what exactly is it that you want? They need to be understandable by all the stakeholders that need to understand them. Shouldn't have any superfluous information. So a bunch of other stuff in there. For one thing, it just makes documents really long and really hard to read. So we don't need a bunch of extra information in there. However, we don't want to cut so much out that it doesn't make sense. So we want to make sure that what we've got is valid. If I can look at this and go, oh, okay, I understand what it is. That's what we're after. The other thing that I have a problem with is if it refers to a bunch of other places where I have to look for the information so that I can actually understand what I'm looking at. That's a pain. And after a while, if you've got to look, 3 other places to get these other parts of it, you kind of don't do it after a while. You just go, whatever, close enough, which is a very bad habit, I'll admit. But, you want to make sure that it's got enough information, but not too much, not a burdensome amount. Models and diagrams, I think, add a lot of clarity if they're well drawn and if they're accurate. A lot of times you'll have verbiage in your requirements and then pretty diagrams that go with it, but as changes come in, the verbiage gets changed and the diagrams don't. Well, now I've just created ambiguity. So we want to make sure that those are there, but that they're also kept up to date. And of course, testable. A good requirement is always testable. A good acceptance criteria on a story is always testable. So if you can't understand what to test, probably the developers didn't understand what to develop. Doesn't mean they're not going to develop something, but we want to make sure that they are testable. And then the acceptance. There should be a point where they say, yep, that is exactly what I want. That is perfect. That's just exactly what I want. So that kind of a sign-off concept of an approval. And again, it could be, little atomic stories for requirements. It could be your giant document, but there needs to be a point where we say, yep, we agree. We've got it. These are well covered. So a process for the acceptance and a way to record the acceptance is important. Now, successful requirements, and this is a list of some of the success criteria of requirements here, but they understand the top level critical objectives. Okay, we know that when we're writing these requirements, we have met those critical objectives. We kept those in mind when we did it. Want to make sure we're thinking about stakeholders, not just the users and the customers, but who's paying for this? Who else is going to be affected by this? What about people that didn't use it before but are going to use it? What about, our downstream, the customers of the business? All of the stakeholders, we have to be thinking broadly. Remember, they might be hiding under the couch, so we might have to find them. Want to focus on the required quality, not just the functionality. And this, of course, is near and dear to our hearts as testers, because a lot of times it's, functional, but what about the quality? What about the quality characteristics? What about things like performance? What about things like usability? How good does this have to be? How much time do we need to spend testing this? Is this a medical device that could kill people if it doesn't work? Or is this a game that's, if it fails, it's not a big deal? Although game players may think it's very, very important. So, you can't say, well, because it's a game, it's not as important. Who's the customer, right? This could be critical to somebody. If this is World of Warcraft and they're on level bazillion and it fails, that's going to be a disaster to them. That may cause them to need the medical device. So, you can't trivialize something, even though you say, well, it's not safety critical, so it's not important. It may be very important to your users, so you need to know your users. There's certainly software I use all the time. Word always comes to mind for me, right? It crashes. It crashes a lot. Okay, I have to use it, but I just get used to rebooting it, right? Now, that's kind of interesting because, I never have to reboot my phone. And if I did, I'd be really stunned that I had to reboot it. But I completely accept that I have to reboot the laptop periodically because things have become so corrupted. So you hate to say that, right? But it's kind of what bad level of quality will people accept because they're kind of stuck. They're captive users. Now, obviously, if Word crashes, probably not going to kill me. Although there have been times really where there's been a lot of swearing, but you need to understand what is that required quality. And of course, quantifying our quality characteristics, quality requirements, like how fast does it have to be? How many transactions in a second? How long should the user have to wait for a response? And of course, indicating what the load on the system would be. So if I say, well, 10,000 concurrent users, I would expect to see 2-second response time. Okay, well, then that tells me the kinds of things I need to test. But we need to be realistic about that. Where are our pain points here? You've got some kind of a financial system and it's got to be able to process 30,000 invoices in a day. Yow! That's going to be something we're really going to need to worry about. Don't mix up the ends and the means, right? So we want to accomplish what we're trying to get to, but the means may be different. They may vary with what we're trying to do and how we get to the end. Want to capture our explicit information about value. How important is this? So that we can understand. We can't say, well, this is really important. Well, what's really important? Is this business critical? Is this something that's going to cause actual loss of dollars, loss of customers, loss of people's jobs, reputation of the company? I mean, how important is this? So value can be hard to quantify. Make sure there's rich specification, meaning that the specification has the details that you need to understand it, not just a little cryptic sentence and you can't really figure out what it means. Make sure there's quality control on the specifications, and it's even stuff like fixing typos and formatting problems, because sometimes those can become understanding issues, when you can't really understand what somebody's saying there. Consider the total life cycle in the system, not just the software. This is when we get into the business processes, other interfacing systems, understanding how the users actually work, where they're going to be, really getting a feel for what this is going to be, so that we are kind of become the stakeholders and kind of have that feel about the software. And then, of course, managing change. Incredibly important. If you're going to have a good requirements process, we want to be able to manage change effectively. So constraints. A constraint is a requirement that explicitly and intentionally tries to restrict any system or process. Okay, so this means this is something we have to work within. So maybe it has to run on Windows 10. Okay, that's a constraint. Done. We got to do that. Okay, that's basically an example of a constraint. So business constraints limit the project's flexibility. So we might not be able to implement a solution in a certain way. Technical constraints restrict the architecture. So, kind of have two things to work with. But constraints are real, and we need to test those constraints as well as understand those constraints. Now, assumptions are conditions that are believed to be true, but we haven't confirmed that they're true yet. Okay, so, and if they're not true, we might have all kinds of surprises coming. So if we assume, let's see, what could we assume? Maybe we assume that all of our Windows 10 users are only using IE as a browser. Okay, that's a kind of a gross assumption, right? So that means if we go with that assumption and say, okay, cool, we never need to test Chrome or Firefox or Edge, we never have to worry about any of those things. Ooh-wee, dangerous, right? So defining the constraints and assumptions, defining them clearly and getting them out in front of the stakeholders and the project team, really important for the success of a project. Because as you can see, right, if we're wrong on some of those constraints and assumptions, we can deliver a solution that is beautiful and wonderful and very feature rich, but fails because it doesn't comply with the constraints or because we made an assumption we shouldn't have. So really important to have those defined and clearly understood by the project team. Now, a little bit about verification and testing. So verification is when we confirm, well, here's the definition here, by examination and through the provision of objective evidence that a specified requirement has been fulfilled. Okay, so this means, does the software work per the documented requirements? Okay, that's what we do a lot of our testing on. That's specification-based testing right there. That's kind of the definition of it. That's verification. So that's what we tend to focus on. Now, obviously, if that requirement that we're testing to was never right, we're not going to know. We're going to say, ooh, this is an awesome product. It works really well. Look, it does exactly what the requirements say, but the requirements were wrong. Okay, so we have to be careful about just concentrating on verification. We have to validate as well. So validation is the activity of confirmation by examination and through provision of objective evidence that the requirements for a specific intended use or application have been fulfilled. Does it do what the customer needs it to do? That's validation. And this is where that business analysis aspect comes in so importantly. User acceptance testing, workshops, solution demonstrations, getting the stakeholders involved so they can see the solution and they can understand if this is really going to do what they need it to do. So as you can imagine, validation is probably more important than verification. Really, we've got to make sure, well, ideally we do both, but we've got to do that validation to make sure that what we're delivering is actually what they need and it's going to fulfill their needs. Tools and techniques, lots of them out there. I won't bore you with these definitions. I just liked some of these words. So there's a lot of techniques in business analysis. PESTLE and MOST, gotta like that one. SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. CATWO, the 5 whys, 6 thinking hats, gotta like that one for generating options and ideas. And VPECT, which just is fun to say, but that analyzes the expectations of a bunch of different parties that have different views of the system. So there's a lot of techniques that are used to basically elicit requirements and then also to expand on the requirements. And some of these are actually quite interesting. So, you know, if you're interested in building your business analysis skills, it's worth looking into these actually. They're you know, some of these I didn't know before I was working on the syllabus, and you think actually that would work pretty well. So definitely good. The 5 whys is kind of the equivalent of having a 3-year-old, because it basically, you go through 5 levels of saying why in a situation. They go, well, I need to do this. Why? Well, because of this. Why? Because of this. Why? You know, and you go through 5 levels of whys, which could probably be annoying. You might want to explain earlier why you're doing this. Why? But you know, it's kind of interesting, these different ways of getting people to think a little outside the box and getting better information from them. Moscow, used pretty commonly. This basically is a prioritization system. We have the must-have. So if that solution does not contain that feature, it would be rejected. Should have, solution to be rejected if this item is not implemented correctly. Okay, so you notice the must and the should are actually equal in this. Could, it's not necessary for acceptance, but it will make people happy and would like to have it in the future. It's non-crucial, can be implemented later. So that's Moscow, for it's a prioritization technique. Now, skills and capabilities. This is a tough one because you've got to have good domain knowledge. You've got to be able to understand what the business issues are and how the business is trying to do stuff. You've got to have good analytics skills because you've got to be able to do the analysis, understanding. And remember, we're talking a wide range of things here. We're not just doing a mobile app, right? We might be replacing the entire financial system. So being able to understand how that works. And as testers, we know this, right? You got to jump in, you got to learn quickly because that's what we do. Technical skills to understand engineering, solution feasibility, things like that, and managerial skills. There's a lot of project management that goes into business analysis. You've got to work on that. Probably the most critical, negotiation. And this is getting people to work together and understand that they might have conflicting needs, but they need to come to a common conclusion. Extremely difficult to do. If you've ever worked with a good BA who's really good at this, or a good PM that's good at this, it's an awesome skill. It's one we should all develop just for our own lives, if nothing else. And then communication, making sure we can talk to all levels of management, all different kinds of stakeholders, especially people that might not be happy about the new system. Being able to articulate ideas and thoughts, good technical writing, of course, and good public speaking. So, you know, stuff that we all need anyway to be successful in our job, but particularly critical in business analysis. Facilitation, making sure that we can lead a project, that we can lead a meeting, that we can get people to talk, solve issues together, build up the team, empower people so that they can each do what they're best at. Resolving, of course, resolving conflicts because those are inevitable in any kind of requirement situation. Transforming so that we could go from ideas to actually into solutions, and negotiating. So we're kind of back to that kind of being the go-between guy. So being good at facilitation is critically important as a business analyst. It's something that they really excel at, probably better than we testers do. But again, certainly useful skills to learn and something that we could definitely leverage in our everyday lives here. So business analysis. We need the skills and knowledge. We need training, honestly, because some of the soft skill techniques, you can't really learn them on your own. You need to kind of interact, have somebody advise you on how to do it, guide you along the way, because honestly, you might not be very good at some of them to start with. But, you know, we need those skills in place. Regardless of what lifecycle model we're using, we've got to have requirements in some form. And those have got to be identified and they've got to be agreed to. And that means we've got to pull in all of those skills to help us do it and do it well. It's a truth here. People won't naturally be able to explain what they want or maybe even what they need. They're not good at it. So being able to identify that, talk to them, help them understand, elicit those requirements from them, it's a real skill set. But what an awesome skill to have, right? To be able to really understand what people want. Good business analysis skills, I think, are critical for success, for the success of a project, for our success as testers, for, you know, something that we need to bring really to every project. So what next? So the IQBBA foundation level certification is really a good place to start. It's a foundation level specification. It's focused on business analysis. And it really goes, you know, I basically hit the highlights here, but you can download the syllabus from the ASTQB website. It gives a good foundation level, and there's training available from the our various accredited training providers, as you'll see on the website, the ASTQB website. You can look up for a list of training providers and you'll see ones that teach the IQBBA foundation syllabus. It's really quite good, and I think it's skills that we all need. We'll be better testers, we'll be better project managers, whatever aspect we have within the project. If we have those business analysis skills, we'll be better at our jobs. So certainly something that I would encourage you to consider. There is a certification exam if you want to go through and have at least that credential added to your list. But I think it's definitely it's a good read, but it's one of those things where training is, I think, really helpful, because it's one of those you can read it and you can go, oh, okay, I now understand about how to do the 5 whys, but you might just be annoying doing it, right? If you're trained on how to do it well, you might be a lot better at it, and not so much of a 3-year-old. I don't know, maybe it won't make any difference, but I think the training actually is quite helpful because of those soft skill things. It's really helpful to be able to practice those as well. And that's all I had. Ran a little bit long here. Dave, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Judy. Yeah, you did a great job in spite of any technical issues, which if honestly, if there were any, I couldn't notice from my end. So you did a great job. Thanks for really doing a wonderful presentation and covering really a tremendous amount of information. It kind of shows why there is a certification that goes around that. I do have a few questions, and if anyone else has some questions, feel free to chime in. But one of those that came in just as we were wrapping up here says, is there an quote eliciting requirements, end quote? Is there an eliciting requirements class available geared toward BAs or testers who already have some skills in this area?
Yeah, there certainly are. And again, if you look at our accredited training providers, there's a number of them that have that teach the BA skills as well. Now, you know, there's also the IIBA, which is one of the big worldwide business analysis organizations, and they have quite an extensive body of knowledge as well. But I think for if I were just looking for a class, I think I would go after the ASTQB training providers and go after something that would give you the kind of the little bit more focused, maybe probably a little bit shorter class, maybe a 2-day or 3-day class. It would really help you hone those skills, because I think we all have, you know, some of these skills, but maybe we haven't developed them to the level that we'd like to, and we could really sharpen them up and be a lot more effective with a relatively small amount of input there. But yeah, there definitely are courses, and I would look there first, honestly.
Okay, here's another question, and you've talked about the evolution of development and you know, and obviously Agile is not new, but it's new to a number of people, and they can see other, you know, what's going to happen a few years down the road. And since you're calling from the future right now, the question is, do you think BA skills will continue to be important? Is that something that as a tester I need to really consider, and you know, is it going to go out of vogue anytime soon?
I think the BA skills are actually becoming more critical. And as we become more into these iterative and agile models where we're working more closely with the stakeholders, we're all working more closely with the stakeholders. I think having these good skills becomes even more critical. So I do not see this as being something that's going to go out of fashion anytime in the future. And, you know, being that I am speaking from the future, but yeah, I see a lot more need for the skills, honestly, than there was 10 years ago.
Interesting. Here's another question. And maybe it goes back a little bit. The first question talked about someone said they have some skills in this area. Someone says, if I've always been a tester, I've just been a tester, do I have a chance to get the certification?
That's one thing I like about this foundation level certification, because you don't have to have had your 2,000 hours as a BA to get it. You can actually go look it through and I think, you know, take one of the classes, or, you know, if you want to self-study, either way. But I think you can actually get yourself up to speed and learn quite a lot fairly easily, because a lot of it is logical. You know, it's not like it's some weird thing where you go, oh, that's really weird. But it's more like you think, oh, that's a good idea. So yeah, if you've always been a tester, and even if you've been a very quiet tester who prefers to be left alone, I think these are really good skills to learn, and it doesn't take very long to pick it up, honestly. I mean, obviously to hone them, right? You'd like to hone them over a long period of time of use, but to understand them and to understand some of the basic techniques, absolutely you can pick that up.
Okay, good. And you can see just from the questions that the experience level is all over the place. Here's another question we have. And then we may make this the last question unless someone shoots one in really quickly, but it says, hi, I have already taken a few BA courses. Can I just take the exam for IQBBA?
Yeah, you can. It's not a training requirement, which I kind of like myself, right? Because I'm kind of more of a self-study kind of person. But yeah, you can just sign up at the ASTQB website and take the exam. You don't have to take the courses. So like you say, right, if you've had training in other areas, I would look through the syllabus myself first, just to make sure that there isn't any terminology that might be different than what you're used to using. But yep, absolutely, you can take the exam. No training required.
No, perfect. So Judy, I wanted to thank you, and everybody who's in the audience or who listens to the recorded version of the webinar, you'll have a chance to meet Judy if you are at the ASTQB Summit, which takes place September 15th in beautiful Southern California, in Irvine, California, and it'll be a little change from New Zealand for Judy. And if any of you are looking for a way to extend your summer, you'll find some beautiful beaches nearby as well. But really, the neat thing about the summit, and Judy, you can probably chime in a little bit, but the nice part about it is it's really one day deep dive, a lot of great information, and the speakers are just incredible in their knowledge base. So there will be a chance to talk with them one-on-one as well. Thoughts?
Yeah, that is one of the things that's going to be more of an intimate kind of conference so that you have accessibility to the speakers and, can talk over your problems and your concerns. There's actually going to be a panel session where you can fire questions from the audience, which ought to be entertaining. But it's a wide range of topics that are going to be covered there. As Dave says, some of it's a deep dive in some of these, and I think I'm talking about user acceptance testing and how that works with business analysis. So, but we have seminars on all sorts of different things. So feel free to look that up and get more details off our website.
Absolutely, and if you are registering, I'd encourage you to do so this week as the early bird ends June 30th. So let me just see if we had one other question. Yeah, so, and it leads me to my next comment, which is this webinar is being recorded, and we will have it posted to the ASTQB website in fairly short order. We'll go ahead and send out an email to everyone when that is available. So if you want to share this with your colleagues, just let them know the recording is available. I think you'll find this very helpful, and I think that it will help really wake up a lot of people as to the importance of business analysis for testers and really as part of that whole team. So, Judy, I want to thank you once again for joining us today, and I hope everyone looks forward to seeing you in September in Irvine.
Thanks, Dave.
With that, we'll end the webinar. Thanks for everyone for participating. We look forward to having you join us for future webinars.